It wasn't just another American fighter plane. This machine was the hammer that would shatter Japanese naval air power once and for all. On June 19, 1944, when those dark blue Hellcats came screaming down through our formations with pinpoint accuracy, every Japanese pilot in the sky felt it. The era of the Zero had come to an end. The F6F Hellcat didn't simply outperform the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0. It hunted it down with cold, mechanical precision. 650 caliber Browning machine guns, perfectly aligned to meet at a lethal range. Armor so thick it might as well have been bulletproof. And under that sleek nose, a roaring Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower strong, propelling the Hellcat past 380 miles per hour and climbing more than 2,500 feet a minute. What took place that day above the Philippine Sea wasn't a dogfight. It was an execution, in what American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost nearly 480 aircraft. The Americans? Only 33. This is the story of how the F6F Hellcat became the most dominant naval fighter ever built, achieving an unheard-of kill ratio of 19-1, and how it crushed the once invincible Zero in the most decisive carrier battle in history. The road to that fateful day began on June 6, 1944, when Task Force 58 steamed out of Majuro Harbor in the Marshall Islands. It took 5 long hours for the last ship to clear the port. The largest carrier armada the world had ever seen was on its way to the Marianas. At the head of it all stood Vice Admiral Harold D. Latham, one of naval aviation's pioneers, flying since 1915, commanding from his flagship, the USS Lexington. His fleet was a sight to behold. 15 fast carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers stretched across miles of open ocean. The carriers alone carried 956 aircraft, 475 of them Hellcats. The entire force was divided into 4 task groups, each one able to operate independently if needed. Task Group 58.1, under Rear Admiral T.R. Tex Halley aboard the USS Hornet, included the Yorktown, Belleau Wood, and Baton. Task Group 58.2, commanded by Rear Admiral L.P. Henson from the USS Bunker Hill, included the Wasp, Monterey, and Cabot. Task Group 58.3, led by Rear Admiral R.B. Colton on the USS Enterprise, brought along the Lexington, Princeton, and San Jacinto. And finally, Task Group 58.4, under Rear Admiral E.F. Donnelly from the USS Essex, included the Langley and Cowpens. Facing this massive armada, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa could muster only 9 carriers, fielding around 430 aircraft. His first mobile fleet included the brand-new Taiho as his flagship, the Pearl Harbor veterans Shokaku and Zuikaku, and the carriers Junyo, Hio, Ryuho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. But numbers alone didn't tell the whole story. Most of Ozawa's airmen were green replacements, barely trained, many with fewer than 100 hours in the cockpit. Some had logged just 50. Many of those young Japanese pilots had never even fired their guns during training. Ammunition was so scarce that live fire practice just wasn't possible. They were being sent into combat against Americans who'd logged 300 to 400 hours in the air. Hours filled with rigorous gunnery training and brutal carrier landing drills. By June 11, 1944, Task Force 58 kicked off its assault on the Marianas. Fighter sweeps and bombing runs hammered Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The Japanese were completely blindsided. They'd assumed our next move would be against the Carolines. Only about 50 land-based aircraft were stationed to defend the Marianas. In the very first sweep alone, 208 Hellcats roared in and claimed 86 enemy planes destroyed. That day marked the beginning of the systematic destruction of Japanese air power in the region. Leading many of those early strikes was Commander Robert Lindholm, head of Air Group 15 from the USS Essex. Lindholm was a 34-year-old from Alabama, a man who had once struggled so badly at gunnery training that his own pilots helped him cheat his way through, painting their bullets the same color as his so his hits would count. No one could have guessed that this same man would go on to become the Navy's all-time top ace. On June 15th, American troops stormed the beaches of Saipan. Almost immediately, Admiral Suemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, activated Operation Ago. This was it, the decisive showdown Japan had been chasing ever since Midway. Every ship, every plane they could muster was thrown into the fight. The plan hinged on coordination. Admiral Ozawa's carrier air groups would strike in tandem with land-based aircraft from Guam and Tinian. They also believed they had a range advantage. Their planes could hit from beyond our reach, touch down on Guam to refuel and rearm, then come back for another attack. But what Ozawa didn't fully grasp was how far American technology had come. Our fleet's radar could spot incoming enemy formations from 150 miles out. Each carrier's combat information center had fighter directors ready to vector Hellcats right into perfect intercept positions. Even if a few enemy bombers slipped past the fighters, our ships had another surprise waiting: proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, still top secret at the time, that could shred anything flying within their reach. And above all else, the F6F Hellcat had been built with one goal in mind: to kill Zeros. That morning, June 19th, started before dawn. In the ready room of VF-16 aboard the Lexington, Lieutenant Junior Grade Martin Kolar went over his plotting board and checked his gear. He already had 12 kills to his name. He'd spent months flying as the wingman to the Navy's first ace, Samuel Buck Denning, and had learned from the best. Now, on this day, he was about to carve his own name into history. At 07:45 hours, the submarine USS Albacore, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Peter Alden, fired 6 torpedoes at Admiral Ozawa's flagship, the brand-new carrier Taiho. Overhead, Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu spotted the torpedo wakes and did something incredible. He deliberately dove his plane straight into one of them, sacrificing himself to save the ship. His kamikaze act destroyed one torpedo, but another found its mark, slamming into Taiho's forward elevator pit. At first, the damage didn't seem catastrophic, but ruptured fuel lines began leaking dangerous fumes throughout the carrier. Then came the fatal mistake. An inexperienced damage control officer ordered the ventilation system open to clear the air. Instead, he spread those volatile fumes to every corner of the ship. Hours later, at 15:32, Taiho erupted in a massive explosion and sank beneath the waves, taking 650 men with her. Back on our side, at 08:30, radar operators aboard Task Force 58 picked up the first wave of incoming enemy aircraft. 69 Japanese planes had launched from Ozawa's carriers, flying at the edge of their range. "Vector 250, Angels 25, bogies approaching," crackled the radio. Fighter directors went to work immediately. Hellcats already in the air climbed hard to gain altitude. The ones still on deck scrambled to launch. Commander Henry Talcott, leading VF-15 from the Essex, was one of the first to spot the incoming formation. "Tally-ho! Bandits bearing 265, distance 40 miles, Angels 18, he called out over the radio. And just like that, the deadliest machine of war ever forged by American naval aviation roared to life. Hellcats from several carriers began closing in on the enemy, guided by fighter directors who watched the whole engagement unfold in glowing radar sweeps miles away. The Japanese pilots flew in tight formation, wings locked, maintaining their heading straight and level toward our ships. It was discipline, sure, but it was also their first and fatal mistake. Lieutenant Commander Leon Mercer, who commanded VF-16, later recalled it vividly. "They came in like they were on parade, perfect formation. Our guys couldn't believe it. They just stayed in line while we tore them apart." At 25,000 feet, Commander Lindholm led 12 Hellcats from VF-15 and caught sight of the enemy below. "I made a modified high-side run," he later wrote. "Only my starboard guns fired, which threw me into a violent skid. I charged the guns twice again, and since my target had pushed over and picked up speed, it turned into a stern chase. The Japanese Judy dive bomber he was chasing tried desperately to escape. But Lindholm's Hellcat was faster, steadier, and far more lethal. His 650 caliber guns lit up the sky, converging perfectly, and the Judy exploded in a flash of flame. The slaughter had begun. By the time the smoke cleared, Lindholm had destroyed 5 Judy dive bombers that morning. Later that same afternoon, he downed 2 Mitsubishi A6M-0s over Guam, 7 kills in a single day, June 19th. His wingman, Lieutenant Dean Coulter, would go on to make his own mark later that year during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Junior Grade Martin Kolar was fighting a battle of his own, against his own airplane. The supercharger in his F6F had failed, limiting both his speed and altitude. Unable to keep pace with his squadron, he turned his division back toward the main task force. That's when he spotted them. A massive formation of Judy dive bombers was heading straight for our fleet. What happened next became the stuff of legend. They were so thick down there over the water, Kolar later said. I felt like a kid with a plate of cookies. Worried somebody else was going to grab some before I could get 'em, even though I already had more than I could eat. In just 8 minutes, using only 360 rounds of ammunition, barely 10 rounds per gun per kill, Kolar shot down 6 Judy dive bombers. His shooting was so precise, it was almost surgical. When he landed back aboard the Lexington, he climbed out of his Hellcat still in full flight gear, grinning ear to ear, and held up 6 fingers for the photographers. That picture, him smiling, confident, and covered in sweat, became one of the most famous images of the war, the perfect symbol of American dominance in the sky. Later, while inspecting his aircraft, Kolar discovered that the wing fold pins had been sticking out during the entire flight. He just fought and won. The best fight of his career with his wings only half locked into place. The first Japanese wave was being wiped from the sky. Out of 69 aircraft that had taken off, out of the 69 Japanese planes that launched in that first wave, 42 were shot down. The few who managed to limp back to their carriers brought with them stories of sheer horror. Hellcats coming from every direction, above and below, fast, relentless, and armed to the teeth. The second wave, 128 aircraft launched around 0900, fared even worse. By then, just about every Hellcat in Task Force 58 was either in the air or waiting on deck with engines screaming for takeoff. Our fighter directors had perfect radar plots of the incoming raid, positioning us right where we needed to be. The Japanese pilots flew straight into a wall of Hellcats, stacked neatly at the ideal intercept altitudes. Lieutenant Thomas Varela of VF-9, flying from the Yorktown, had come up with a deadly new tactic he called the mowing machine. Working with 3 other pilots, Peter Doran, Warren Mills, and Glenn Porter, Varela had formed what might have been the most dangerous 4-man team in naval aviation. Between them, they'd go on to score 50 kills, but on June 19th, they were just part of the massive defensive effort in the sky. Fighting Squadron 1 from the Yorktown had a phenomenal day. Under Commander Smoke Streen, VF-1 claimed 37 Japanese planes destroyed. Lieutenant Junior Grade Arthur Carr shot down 5 himself, making ace in a single day. Their Hellcats dove from 24,000 feet into the chaos below, 10,000 feet down, guns blazing in every direction. The technical difference between the 2 aircraft was staggering. The Japanese Zero, fully loaded, weighed just over 5,300 pounds. The Hellcat came in at nearly 12,600. That extra weight wasn't wasted. It was armor, reinforced structure, and self-sealing fuel tanks that made the plane a flying fortress. A Zero pilot sat behind a thin sheet of aluminum. A Hellcat pilot, on the other hand, had armor plate behind him, armor under his seat, and thick bulletproof glass in front. If a Zero took one incendiary hit to its fuel tank, it was gone in a fireball. The Hellcat's tanks, though, sealed themselves automatically, the layers of rubber expanding as soon as they were punctured. And then there was the power plant. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2810 engine pumped out 2,000 horsepower, or 2,200 with water injection during combat emergencies. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai 21 barely managed 1,130. That difference alone meant the Hellcat could outclimb, outdive, and outrun the Zero at any altitude. At 20,000 feet, where most of the fighting took place, the Hellcat could climb 2,000 feet per minute. The Zero, maybe 1,500 on a good day, and it only got worse as they climbed higher. The guns told the rest of the story. The Hellcat carried 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each with 400 rounds, 2,400 in total, bore-sighted to meet at a precise convergence point that formed a deadly cone of fire. The Zero, by comparison, carried two 20mm cannons with just 60 rounds each, plus a pair of 7.7mm machine guns. Those 20mm shells hit hard, sure, but with so little ammunition, Japanese pilots had to make every shot count. Hellcat pilots didn't have that problem. We could let the guns sing, walking streams of tracers until they connected. At 1,000 hours, the third wave appeared. 47 aircraft from Ozawa's Carrier Division 2, Junyo, Hyo, and Ryuho. They never even found us. Lost and disoriented, they flew aimlessly across the sea, trying to track our movements. Only 7 of them made it back. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a Pearl Harbor veteran flying off the Junyo, was one of the few experienced pilots in that group. After running out of fuel, he crash-landed on Rota Island. When he climbed out and saw his riddled aircraft, he reportedly said, "I've never seen so many Grummins." His plane looked like a piece of Swiss cheese, full of bullet holes. Commander Peter Jigdog, Ramage of Bombing Squadron 10 from the Enterprise, watched it all unfold from above. "Our fighters had a field day," he said. "The Japanese came in perfect formations, and our boys just cut them apart. It was like watching a training exercise. Only this time, the targets were real." By 1100 hours, the fourth wave launched, 82 aircraft strong, and they were about to meet the same fate. By midday, some of our pilots were almost starting to feel sorry for the enemy. Ensign Patrick Spider Webb of VF2 later said, "They were so green, they stayed in formation even while we were firing on them. They didn't try to break away or dodge. It was both impressive and heartbreaking, watching such brave men fly straight into certain death." But not every American came through the day untouched. Commander Henry Talcott of VF-15, after downing 3 enemy planes, was himself shot down and killed over Guam. His loss was a harsh reminder that even in what people would later call a turkey shoot, war always demanded its price. Lieutenant Commander Peter Halverson took command of VF-15 and kept the squadron fighting with the same deadly precision that Talcott had instilled. At 11:18 that morning, the submarine USS Kavala, under Lieutenant Commander Victor Dane, maneuvered into position and fired 6 torpedoes at the carrier Shokaku. 3 of them hit home. The Shokaku, a Pearl Harbor veteran displacing over 32,000 tons, went down with heavy loss of life. By that point, 2 of Japan's newest and largest carriers were gone, and their naval air arm was being gutted in the sky. Our radar advantage made all the difference. The SK and SK-2 radar systems aboard our carriers could pick up incoming aircraft from as far as 150 miles away, giving us a solid 30 to 40 minutes to prepare. The Japanese, by contrast, had only their eyes. Most of the time, they didn't even spot our fighters until we were already on top of them. Lieutenant Alan Keats, one of the fighter directors aboard the Lexington, personally vectored Hellcats to intercept 35 enemy aircraft that day. He later described the experience as watching a chess match from above. He could see the whole board, while his opponent could only see a few scattered pieces. The fighter direction system itself was a marvel of organization and nerve. Each carrier's Combat Information Center, CIC for short, was a dimly lit room packed with radar screens, plotting boards, and radio consoles. Inside, trained fighter directors calmly managed the chaos of battle, tracking multiple enemy raids, guiding interceptors into position, and keeping the fleet one step ahead. Their voices stayed cool and steady, even as dozens of enemy planes streaked toward the task force. Vector 270, Angels 20, bogies approaching, investigate and report. That calm tone kept the system running like clockwork. Every voice measured, every call precise. Lieutenant Commander Patrick R. Killer Kane, who led Air Group 10 from the Enterprise, flew through both June 19th and 20th. In his diary, he wrote simply, "The greatest air defeat suffered by any nation, ever." It hit home for a lot of us. Kane had started the war flying outdated planes, going up against Japanese pilots who outmatched us in every way. Now, just a few years later, he was commanding squadrons of Hellcats, machines that ruled the sky. By that stage in the war, we were flying the best fighter on the planet, flown by pilots who were expertly trained and backed by radar controllers who could see everything happening across the sky. Looking back, I think our training system might have been the real secret weapon. By June of 1944, new Navy pilots were arriving at the front with 300 to 400 hours of flight time under their belts. They'd already practiced carrier landings dozens of times on converted Great Lakes paddle steamers, and they'd fired thousands of rounds during gunnery training. By the time they got to the Pacific, they knew their aircraft like it was part of them. The Japanese, though, by that point, their pilot training had completely fallen apart. Early in the war, they turned out elite aviators with 500 hours or more of experience. But by 44, they were sending barely trained kids into combat with maybe 50, sometimes 100 hours total. Meanwhile, our system kept getting stronger. We had a rotation policy. Experienced combat pilots like Lieutenant Commander Daniel "Danny" Rhodes, the man who invented the famous thatch-weave defensive tactic, were sent back home to train the next generation. Their knowledge didn't die with them. It got passed down, refined, and built into the very DNA of naval aviation. The Japanese didn't have that luxury. They kept their veteran pilots in combat until they were killed. By the summer of '44, most of the men who'd fought at Pearl Harbor or Midway were gone. The few that survived, like Zenji Abe, were exhausted, trying to lead green, terrified rookies against overwhelming American firepower. Our edge in communication sealed the deal. American pilots had reliable VHF radios and used standardized callouts. We could talk, coordinate, warn each other in real time. "Brake right, Blue 2, 0 on your 6. "Roger, braking right, thanks, lead." That kind of teamwork saved lives. The Japanese, on the other hand, had radios so unreliable that many of their pilots just left them out to save weight. In the middle of a dogfight, they relied on hand signals, useless when you're twisting and rolling through gunfire. By noon on June 19th, the first phase of the battle was over. The Japanese had launched 373 carrier planes in 4 separate waves. Of those, around 346 had been shot down that day alone. Our total losses? 33 aircraft, with 26 airmen killed or missing, most of them lost to accidents, not enemy fire. The ocean around Task Force 58 was littered with burning wreckage, drifting oil slicks, and enemy pilots, clinging to life rafts. Admiral Mitcher, standing on the flag bridge of the Lexington, turned to his staff and said quietly, "The Japanese carrier air force has been destroyed. They'll never recover from this." He was right. Japan hadn't just lost airplanes, they'd lost their pilots, the core of their carrier power. Ships could be rebuilt, sure, but trained aviators, they took years to make. And Japan no longer had that kind of time. That afternoon, the fight still wasn't done. American fighters kept hunting over Guam and Rota, catching Japanese planes trying to land and refuel. Pilots from VF-16, including Alex Kolar, flew multiple sorties that day, adding to their already staggering kill counts. When the smoke finally cleared, the total Japanese losses, including land-based aircraft, had climbed to roughly 480 planes, and while the pilots rested, our ground crews worked miracles. Damaged Hellcats were patched up and ready to fly again by morning. The Navy's logistics system, its lifeline, kept the entire machine running, fuel, ammo, spare parts, all delivered in staggering amounts, exactly when and where we needed them. Each carrier in Task Force 58 was practically a floating factory. Every one of them had machine shops capable of fabricating replacement parts from scratch. damaged engines could be pulled out and swapped within hours. The Japanese, on the other hand, were falling apart. With their supply chains shattered and production lagging far behind, they were forced to cannibalize damaged planes just to keep a handful flying. As the sun dipped below the horizon on June 19th, Admiral Ozawa still clung to the hope that he might salvage something from the day's disaster. He had no real grasp of how bad things truly were. His surviving pilots, dazed and shaken, returned claiming they'd shot down hundreds of American planes. In truth, they'd barely scratched us. The few Japanese aviators who did make it back were utterly spent, mentally, physically, and emotionally broken. June 20th brought the next chapter, the American counterstrike. All through that day, our search planes had been scouring the Pacific, trying to locate what was left of the Japanese fleet. Finally, at 1540, Lieutenant Howard Fenton from the Enterprise spotted them, 275 miles west of Task Force 58. That was extreme range, almost too far for our aircraft to reach and still make it home, and launching so late in the day meant only one thing: they'd be returning after dark. But Admiral Mitcher didn't even flinch. "Launch them," he ordered. At 1624, the flight decks roared to life. 216 aircraft thundered off into the fading light. 85 Hellcats, 77 dive bombers, and 54 torpedo bombers. Every pilot knew the stakes. They'd be pushing their planes to the edge of their fuel range. Some wouldn't make it back. But the chance to finish off what was left of the Japanese fleet was too great to pass up. Lieutenant Commander Jig Dog Ramage led Bombing Squadron 10's dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise. As they neared the enemy fleet, he could see the Japanese ships spread out across miles of open ocean. 3 carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, all maneuvering below. A few Japanese fighters clawed their way up to intercept, but the escorting Hellcats cut them down almost immediately. The attack itself was chaotic, but devastatingly effective. The carrier Hio took multiple bomb and torpedo hits and went under. Zuikaku was badly damaged, as were Junyo and Chiyoda. The battleship Haruna took a direct bomb hit, and 2 Japanese oilers were sent to the bottom. But the real nightmare came on the flight home. As darkness fell, our aircraft began running out of fuel, one by one. The radios came alive with panic. "This is Blue 7, engines dead, going in." "Red 3 ditching, send help." You could hear the fear in their voices. Pilots were glancing at fuel gauges dropping towards 0, doing mental math to figure out if they could even make it back to the task force. That's when Admiral Mitcher made one of the bravest and most famous decisions of the entire war. Despite the risk of giving away our position to submarines, he ordered, "Turn on the lights." And they did. Every ship in Task Force 58 lit up the night. Searchlights pointed skyward, flight decks glowed, and even star shells burst above the fleet to guide us home. The middle of the Pacific suddenly looked like Times Square. Lieutenant Commander Calvin Price of VF-18 later said, "I was running on fumes when I saw those lights. It was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I didn't care whose carrier it was. I just needed a deck." He ended up landing on the Yorktown instead of the Hornet, but they waved him in and welcomed him like he belonged there. The recovery that night was absolute bedlam. Planes came in from every angle, landing on whatever flight deck they could find. Some hit too hard and crashed, blocking the decks for those still circling above. Others ran out of fuel entirely and ditched into the dark sea beside the ships. Destroyers raced through the waves, their searchlights cutting across the water as they pulled pilot after pilot from the ocean. Out of the 216 aircraft we'd launched that evening, 80 were lost, but most of the men made it home alive. 49 aircrew were killed or went missing that night. A heartbreaking number, sure, but still fewer than the Japanese had lost in pilots from just one of their carriers. Commander Kane summed it up best in his diary. "Mitcher took a hell of a risk lighting up the fleet, but he saved a lot of good men. That's the kind of leader men will follow anywhere." And that was the truth. Admiral Mitcher had risked his ships to save his boys, and we all knew it. When the sun rose the next morning, The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. In just 2 days, Japan had lost nearly 600 aircraft, 3 carriers, and 2 oilers. But the real loss wasn't steel. It was flesh and blood. Almost every trained carrier pilot they had left was gone. Our own losses totaled 123 aircraft, most of them from fuel starvation on the 20th, not enemy fire. It was clear now. The Hellcat had done exactly what it was built to do. The F6F, the main version that dominated the skies over the Philippine Sea, was a masterpiece of American engineering. She had a wingspan of 42 feet, 10 inches, and stretched 33 feet, 7 inches from nose to tail. She weighed just over 9,200 pounds empty, armor included. Thick plating around the cockpit, the oil cooler, and the oil tank. Her self-sealing fuel tanks could take multiple hits and keep working, and the windscreen up front could shrug off a 20mm cannon shell. At her heart was the mighty Pratt & Whitney R2810, double Wasp engine, a mechanical miracle. With water injection, it could crank out 2,200 horsepower during combat emergencies, and it was tough as nails. More than a few Hellcats came home with whole cylinders shot off, engines coughing and sputtering, but still running strong enough to land. The 3-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller was perfectly matched to that engine, giving the plane outstanding climb and acceleration. Even the guns were engineered to perfection. 6 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each with 400 rounds, mounted in the wings, staggered so they wouldn't interfere with each other's recoil. They were harmonized to meet at about 300 yards ahead, forming a cone of fire roughly 6 feet wide. When you squeezed the trigger, a 2-second burst meant 200 rounds ripping into that tight space. Nothing could live through it. And the cockpit, it was built for the man flying it. The pilot sat high, with clear visibility in every direction. The controls were smooth, instinctive, everything right where it should be. The gun sight used a reflector system, projecting a glowing reticle onto the glass in front of you. Simple, effective, deadly accurate. Unlike the Japanese Zero, which needed constant trimming to stay steady, the Hellcat practically flew itself. She was stable, forgiving, and solid. Just about as close to perfect as any fighter could get. One thing that made the Hellcat so unstoppable wasn't just how it fought, but how it was built. Production quality was rock solid from start to finish. Grumman turned out 12,275 Hellcats between 1942 and 1945, peaking at nearly 500 a month. Every one of them rolled off the line exactly the same, part for part. You could take a wing off a Hellcat built in 43 and bolt it straight onto one built in 45. That kind of standardization made maintenance almost effortless. Crews could strip one plane for repairs and have it flying again in hours. The Japanese Zero, by comparison, was still being partly hand-built even in 1944. No two were quite alike. As Japan's resources ran thin, quality dropped fast. Skilled workers had been drafted into the army. Factories were under bombing raids, and material shortages forced shortcuts. Their engines couldn't even make rated power anymore because their fuel and metal were so poor. And that fuel problem told the whole story. Our carriers ran on high-grade, 100-octane aviation gasoline, refined to give maximum punch. The Japanese were down to 87 octane, which meant less power, more engine trouble, and a whole lot of frustration for their pilots. We could push our engines right to combat power without a second thought. They couldn't risk it. For them, even full throttle was a gamble. Behind us was a logistics chain unlike anything the world had ever seen. Fleet oilers hauled millions of gallons of fuel across the Pacific. Supply ships delivered spare parts by the ton. Escort carriers ferried replacement aircraft straight to the front lines. We even had mobile service squadrons that could perform full depot-level maintenance on remote island bases. It was industrial warfare on a scale Japan simply couldn't match. But in the end, it always came down to people. American pilots knew we were flying the best fighter in the world. We trusted our training, our planes, and the leaders who sent us into battle. And we knew that if we went down, the Navy would move heaven and earth to get us back. The Japanese pilots didn't have that comfort. They knew they were flying outdated machines with barely enough training to survive a single dogfight. Being shot down meant death or capture, and most of them expected both. The psychological toll of that June battle, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was devastating. Word spread fast through what was left of Japan's air arm. The Hellcat wasn't just a better airplane, it was untouchable. Morale collapsed. Many Japanese pilots started flying their missions believing they were already dead, long before kamikaze became official policy. The Hellcat hadn't just beaten them in combat, it had crushed their spirit. After the war, the numbers told the full story. Japanese records confirmed that our claims were actually modest. In some cases, their losses were even greater than what we'd reported. That incredible kill ratio of 19-1. It wasn't propaganda. It was fact, verified on both sides of the Pacific. And the Hellcat's dominance didn't end there. On October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Commander Robert Lindholm, our top ace, shot down 9 enemy aircraft in a single mission, a record that still stands. Lindholm's wingman, Lieutenant Dean Coulter, wasn't far behind him that day. He shot down 6 more enemy planes. Between the two of them, 15 kills in a single mission. 2 pilots had done more in one flight than some entire squadrons managed in a day during the early years of the war. By the time the war finally ended, Hellcats had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, while losing only 270 of their own to enemy planes. That astounding 19-1 kill ratio wasn't a rumor. It was a cold, hard fact. Over the course of the war, Hellcat pilots flew more than 66,000 combat sorties, dropped over 6,500 tons of bombs, and established total air superiority wherever they operated. The philosophy behind the Hellcat changed everything that came after it. Every American fighter designed in the years that followed carried the same lessons. Protect the pilot, pack heavy firepower, and build the airframe strong enough to take a beating and come home. The Hellcat proved what modern warfare was really about, that the side with superior technology, training, and industry would always win in the long run. Looking back, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than just a victory. It was proof that the American way of fighting worked. While the Japanese still believed in the lone warrior ideal and lightweight, agile planes, we'd embraced the full weight of industrial warfare. The Hellcat was the embodiment of that idea, tough, powerful, and produced in overwhelming numbers. Admiral Ozawa, who somehow survived the war, later admitted what we all already knew. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the end of Japanese carrier aviation. The Hellcat, backed by better training, better coordination, and the might of American industry, had decided the outcome before the battle even began. Commander Robert Lindholm, who finished the war with 34 victories, all in Hellcats, put it best when he said, "The Hellcat was an honest airplane. It did exactly what you asked it to do. It brought you home. In combat, that's all that matters." And he was right. As the sun set on June 19, 1944, Japanese naval aviation was finished as a fighting force. The few pilots who limped back to their carriers that night knew they'd face their master in the F6F Hellcat. That dark blue fighter, marked with a white star, had ended the myth of Japanese air superiority once and for all. In a single day, American technology, training, and sheer industrial might had triumphed over Japanese bravery and spirit. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot wasn't just another battle. It was the moment American air power proved itself beyond question, delivered by the lethal, unshakable superiority of the F6F Hellcat.